Hi, everyone. I'm going to give it just about another minute here. It looks like people are still popping on here. All right, I think we'll get started. Okay, so welcome everyone. My name is Julie Wolfington, and I'm the Energy and Sustainability Leader for Boland. As you know, this learning session is the first of a two-part series. Today we're going to be talking about sustainability, and next week, same time, same place, we're going to be talking about energy. So we're going to be doing an Energy 101 class as a follow-up. So the idea for this series really came from all of you. As many of you know, or you will soon, HVAC generally makes up 40 to 50% of a building's utility bill. So that makes Boland not just an HVAC company, but also an energy company. We're experts at around half your utility bill. So when we talk to you, whether it's one of our technicians or an account manager, energy comes up a lot. If we see something in your building that's wrong, we let you know not only the operational impact, but the energy impact as well. If we see a chiller or a pump running inefficiently, we like to monetize that for you to help you make a better decision on what to do with it. If we see a way to tighten up your equipment schedules, we'll let you know so you can adjust it, and we'll let you know how much changing it will save you so that you can track and report those savings. Over the years, we've heard many of you talk about how you're being asked to save energy and contribute towards your company's sustainability goals. While many of us in the building industry think, or when many of us in the building industry think of sustainability, we mostly think of just energy, but it's more than that. So that's why we wanted to do this class today. We want to talk about what does that mean in the broader context, and how is our market specifically impacted, and how can we make our buildings and therefore our businesses more sustainable. So now I'd like to introduce Ken Megahed. He's one of our Controls Account Executives, and he's a mechanical engineer who also happens to have a degree in sustainability. So Ken, take it away.
Thank you very much, Julie. As she mentioned, my name's Ken Megahed, and today we're going to talk a little bit about sustainability. As she also mentioned, I did graduate from the University of Maryland with degrees in both mechanical engineering and sustainability. I've also done some work for the United States Army Corps of Engineers, where I was helping implement renewable energy around the C&D Canal. So let's dive right into it. The agenda for today. So we're going to start today's conversation talking about some of the factors and background that have led to the hot topic of sustainability. From there, we're going to explain what sustainability actually is and break it down into what's known as the 3 pillars, or the triple bottom line. From there, we're going to relate the building industry and the HVAC industry to sustainability. And then we'll go into some of the solutions, specifically decarbonization. And then we're going to wrap it all up talking about how the government and corporate influences impact your business. So let's dive into some of these factors. The first one we have to talk about is the general trends of the global population over the past 100 years. So in 1950, the world population was just 2.6 billion people. And today, just 70 years later, we've reached a population of about 7.7 billion people. So that's a pretty eye-opening statistic right there. It took us hundreds of thousands of years to reach 2.5 billion people. And just 70 years later, we increased by another 5 billion. And while our population has been increasing, we've also seen increases in the general quality of life of people. Things like life expectancy, GDP per capita, literacy rates are all increasing. People leaving extreme poverty is also increasing. So we're seeing these generally good trends in population increases and human development. But at the same time, we're also seeing corresponding increases and the usage of resources. So on the left here, we see the global energy consumption over the past 200-ish years. And in fact, in just the last 10 years, we've seen an increase of more than 20,000 terawatt hours of global energy consumption. And to put that into perspective, 1 terawatt hour is enough energy to continuously power about 200,000 homes. And on the right here, we see a similar trend with global fossil fuel consumption, where we've seen an increase of 45% since 1970. And we're also seeing resources increase across the board. Non-metallic minerals have increased 5-fold since 1970. And the reality is that I could pull up charts of plenty of other resources, and we will see similar trends like these two graphs. And we're seeing that we're hitting all-time highs in resource usage almost across the board. Now, resource extraction clearly does have a direct impact on the earth and the environment. But a key to understanding sustainability is that the mass use of these resources causes greenhouse gas emissions. So what exactly is a greenhouse gas? Well, it's any gas that has the ability to trap heat inside of our atmosphere. So heat energy comes from the sun, it reflects off the surface of our planet, and then as it's being reflected back out, these greenhouse gases, these particles in our atmosphere, are absorbing that heat energy. And that includes things like carbon dioxide, methane, nitrous oxide, and even water vapor. And the concern here is that the concentration of these greenhouse gases is accelerating. And this causes warming that increases risks for not just the environment, but risks for us as well. Now, it is true that climate change is a natural occurrence over millions of years, but the problem to understand here is that in the last 200 years, human activity has produced an unnatural amount of these greenhouse gases, which in turn is creating an unnatural change in our climate. And we are seeing the impacts of this. Since the late 19th century, we've seen the Earth rise about 2 degrees in temperatures, and it's been projected that this is a lagging trend. So it took about 150 years to go up 2 degrees. It could be just another 60 years for another 2 degrees. And we're seeing this in a practical sense too. In fact, the DMV area recorded its wettest year ever in 2018. And I'm sure all of you have heard about the forest fires in California. There's been unnatural flooding in places like Germany and China. And in fact, just last month, Italy recorded 29 inches of rain in just 12 hours, which was a European record. And not only are we seeing these impacts, the direct resource extraction has problems associated with it as well. In fact, in about the last 30 years, we've seen almost over 500,000 square miles of forest loss. We're seeing other things like fresh drinking water shortages, loss of biodiversity, soil degradation, and the list goes on. So really the question becomes, what's the solution to all of this? We have these good trends going on in increases in population, increases in human quality of life. But in turn, we also seeing these negative trends with mass emissions and all-time highs in resource extraction. So what's the solution here? How do we balance these positive trends while also reducing these negative trends? Well, the answer here is sustainability. And what sustainability refers to is the capacity for our biosphere and human civilization to coexist. Right now, we have a traditional linear economy referred to as take, make, and dispose. So, you're sucking oil out of the earth, you're sending it to a power plant where it's being burned up and then releasing those emissions into the atmosphere. Instead, what we want to achieve here is a circular and infinite resource economy where we can minimize the use of our resource inputs. And instead of creating waste and pollution and carbon emissions, we want to find ways to reuse or capture those outputs. And that's really the purpose of sustainability. And in fact, a really good definition I found came from the Brundtland Report, which was a document published by the United Nations in 1987. And they defined sustainable development as development that meets the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. So now that we have a general understanding of what sustainability is, let's break it down a little further into what's known as the 3 pillars of sustainability, or the triple bottom line. And if you go out and Google the pillars of sustainability, you might see the 6 pillars or the 12 pillars or something like that. But the most commonly accepted form is the 3 pillars, or the triple bottom line. And these 3 pillars are the environmental pillar, which is what everyone generally associates with sustainability, right? That's the idea of reducing our overall impact on the environment. And like I said, that's the one that everyone thinks about when they think about sustainability. But we also have to consider the other 2 pillars as well, the social and economic pillar. The social pillar is the one that focuses on people and maintaining those positive trends that we talked about earlier. Things like quality of life and making sure people are healthy, educated, and treated fairly. And then we move to the economic pillar, which really highlights the goals of maintaining economic growth and sustainability. But really the key to understanding the 3 pillars of sustainability is that it's a balance, right? We have to make sure that all 3 of these pillars are equal. You know, we can't sacrifice the economic pillar so that we can make the environment better, right? We don't want to be bearable. We want to be sustainable. So to be a truly sustainable business, you can't give up the notion of financial success, right? But at the same time, long-term sustainability of a business requires more than just financial equity. And now we're going to shift gears a little bit into more talking about sustainability as it relates to our industry, the building and commercial HVAC industry. And a key part of understanding that is understanding the concept of urbanization. So right now, about 55% of the world's population lives in cities, but this number is expected to grow to 68% by 2050. So really, this is just showing that the need for buildings and the need for commercial HVAC isn't going away. In fact, it's increasing, and it's projected to increase pretty significantly in just the next 30 years. So now that we see that, we have to look at how a building actually is influenced by things like energy usage and emissions, right? So just looking at energy usage, we can see that buildings use about 40% of it in the United States. And then when you look to the chart on the right, we see that it's an individual building's energy profile, and we see that HVAC accounts for about 50% of that, right? So put those 2 numbers together and we realize that HVAC systems account for about 20% of all US energy consumption.
Yeah, and just to add on to that, Kanan, you know, that's a huge impact. And again, that's why we're here doing these classes. That's why Boland is an energy company, because we are an expert at a huge portion of the utility bill. And when you think about the other big chunk of the utility bill, lighting, you know, that is a little simpler for building owners to solve, right? You turn them off, you dim them, you control them. But HVAC systems are very unique in every single building. They're all different, and they are very complex, sometimes thousands of pieces of equipment, all designed to work together in a specific way. So, you know, being experts on how to do that is something that our clients really come to us to help them with, to solve that big chunk.
Exactly. And another thing we see here is that 39% number. 39% of CO2 emissions are from buildings, right? In the US, 39%. And really, we want to break that down a little bit more. So we mentioned emissions earlier, but let's dig into it a little bit from more of a business perspective. So first off, why is this important? We mentioned earlier how greenhouse gases do affect the Earth. So for businesses, emissions are kind of like a way to gauge your impact on the environment. When you hear a local government say, hey, we want to be net zero, that's them saying they want to have net zero emissions. And really, these emissions include everything from driving a truck down the road to burning gas in a furnace in your basement to turning on a light bulb in your room. And that's kind of this is kind of how we break down those emissions. Scope 1 emissions, those are emissions directly from your building. Scope 2 emissions, those are emissions from a power plant. So when you're using electricity in your building, you're not directly emitting anything, but that power plant down the street is. That's Scope 2 emissions. And then Scope 3 emissions are kind of everything in between, from the transport of raw materials, transport of products, the usage of those products, and the disposal of those products. And to give an example, we'll use a trash can manufacturing plant. So the first thing they're going to have to do is bring in those raw materials, right? Those plastics and other materials that are needed to actually create those trash cans. And that's going to involve loading up a cargo ship, sending it across the Pacific, and bringing it to your manufacturing plant. And that's those Scope 3 upstream emissions. From there, you might have some giant gas-fired furnace that's melting down all those plastics to be molded. That furnace, that's your Scope 1 emissions, the emissions coming directly from your facility. And then after that, you probably would have some kind of giant assembly line with a bunch of moving parts consuming a lot of electricity. And that's your Scope 2 emissions, those emissions coming out of the power plant. And then from there, you're going to have to distribute those trash cans. Then they're going to be used, they're going to be tossed around and beat up, and then they're going to be disposed. That's your downstream Scope 3 emissions. Now, with the trash can manufacturing plant, those Scope 3 emissions are not that significant, right? It's really just the transport part of it and then the disposal. But to tie it back into HVAC, we just showed you that HVAC accounts for about 20% of all energy use in the United States. So clearly our industry has massive Scope 3 emissions and thus a massive impact on sustainability, right? So what exactly is our industry doing about this? Well, just like many companies in our industry, Trane is setting goals to impact all 3 pillars of sustainability, because we realize that it's both good for us as a business and it's the right thing to do. So the first goal we want to talk about here is what's known as the Gigaton Challenge. And that is essentially Trane's goal of reducing our customers' carbon emissions by 1 gigaton by 2030. And to put that into perspective, 1 gigaton of carbon emissions is equal to the annual emissions of Italy, France, and the UK combined. And really, we're achieving this in all sorts of ways, innovating new technologies, implementing sustainability strategies, and optimizing our supply chain. Another big goal set out by Trane is called leading by example. And this one involves things like striving for carbon neutral operations, delivering zero waste to landfills, net positive water usage, and reaching a 10% absolute reduction in energy consumption. And then finally, we see the opportunity for all goal. And this one really tackles that social pillar of sustainability that we talked about earlier. So things like workforce diversity reflective of our communities, gender parity in leadership roles, and creating pathways to green and STEM careers. And now we're going to shift gears once again into more of the solutions aspect and how our industry is practically tackling sustainability.
All right, so like Kanan said, we're going to narrow our focus a little bit to what we in our industry have the most impact on, which is sustainable and energy efficient buildings. A sustainable building means a sustainable building throughout its life cycle. So, and here's the good news. Generally, a sustainable building results in the lowest total cost of ownership, which is what we all want, right? So being sustainable means using less, reusing when possible, and if you're using less, you're spending less. So there's 3 phases in a building's life. First, you have to design and construct it. In order to do that in a sustainable way, create a sustainable and healthy design for that building. Use smart, energy efficient systems and equipment and renewable energy where it's feasible. Use rating systems like LEED and WELL, which we'll dig into a little bit more later, to give you design assistance on how to do that, as well as to serve as really a measuring stick to determine how sustainable your design is. So phase 2, this is obviously the longest phase of a building's life, sustain and operate. So how do you keep that building healthy and efficient? From the day most buildings are commissioned, many of those, the building performance declines significantly. We see it all the time. So the key is to continuously monitor and tune that building. Incorporate new technologies as they become available and they're economically feasible to help you do that. Continually educate your building staff. They oftentimes hold the keys to your energy bills because they're operating these systems. And continue to use your measuring sticks. Recertify your building, continually track and benchmark your Energy Star score, for example, to make sure that you're staying where you want to be. So phase 3, restore and modernize. Now that your building systems have lived beyond their useful life, it's time to upgrade, replace, modernize those obsolete systems. The first thing to do when it's time to do this is think about, what are your business goals? What are you trying to accomplish with this? You know, are you just trying to renovate the building so you can flip it next year? Or are you trying to go net zero? Those goals are really going to drive this process for you. And it helps you figure out what approach to take. So the good news is that new equipment is more efficient than old equipment, which means that there is a return on investment when you do restore and modernize these systems. And as we'll discuss later, the government wants you to have a more energy efficient building. So there are programs and ways that they are going to help you pay to make your buildings more energy efficient.
So that's really the key, right? To have a sustainable building, you really have to make sure it's sustainable in all 3 of those phases, right? From the beginning when it's constructed, to when you're maintaining and operating it, to even when you want to refurbish it somewhere down the road. And really, there is plenty of opportunities to do so. Just a few examples I'm going to list off here. One, as Julie mentioned earlier, lighting's a big part of it. If you upgrade from fluorescent to LED light bulbs, you're cutting your lighting energy usage in half immediately. And not only are you cutting your energy usage in half, you're also increasing the lifespan of those bulbs. So that's kind of, you know, you're helping the environment and you're helping your pocketbook at the same time. There's also opportunities like incorporating controls into your building, implementing a building automation system that runs off of occupancy or schedules instead of doing it manually can really improve the energy usage of your building. Another example, upgrading your refrigerants. Maybe if you're looking to get a new chiller into your building, ask about what options you have for refrigerants. Try and find those refrigerants with lower global warming potential. You could also implement on-site renewables and essentially just cut out those utility emissions by having your own on-site energy ready. And of course, we'll dive into these more as the presentation goes on, but that's just a few ways that your building can be more sustainable for the environmental pillar and even a little bit of the economic pillar. And now Julie's going to dig into even more and highlight some of the ways a building can be more sustainable from the social pillar perspective.
So Kanaan mentioned smart buildings. So don't mind doing another click. There we go. Thank you. So smart, I've got SHE, smart, healthy, and efficient is really what truly makes a sustainable building. So a sustainable building should provide a healthy indoor environment for tenants, and it should promote a positive, healthy experience. Most humans spend most of their lives indoors. So improving that experience and making it healthy is very important to a sustainable building. So smart buildings use IoT sensors, Internet of Things devices, to monitor what's going on in a building. What's the temperature, where are the occupants? Then they analyze the data and generate insights based on patterns and trends. This information can then be used to optimize the building. These systems share information across building systems to optimize total building performance and make occupants more productive and happier by improving illumination, thermal comfort, air quality, physical security, sanitation, and many other aspects. So, and in doing all of this at the lowest cost and environmental impact over the building's life cycle. So for example, you can use a single occupancy sensor in the building to turn on a light, open the blinds, tell the air conditioning system to bring in more fresh air, and help with contact tracing if needed. So sensors can be connected and responsive to the smart power grid. And they interact with the building's operators and occupants to really, empower them with visibility and actionable information that they can, do something with. So, but what's great about, when you talk about all these things together, I mentioned that what that single occupancy sensor can do. So the fact that many of these sensors and all this information is shared is really what makes these systems affordable and lowers that life cycle cost of the building. So with respect to smart buildings, what really another aspect of that, a very significant aspect of that, is having real-time information. Monitoring energy meters along with the systems that use energy in your building really allows you and enables you to identify issues and anomalies associated with that building's performance and energy usage. I can't stress how important this is. I see it every day, a beautiful, energy efficient, LEED certified building that, a year later, that building has an Energy Star score of a 50. It drops from like a 75 to a 50. So, again, continuously monitoring and getting that real-time information is critical. We're remotely connected to and run analytics on hundreds of buildings in our area. And this really allows us to keep our trained eyes on buildings for clients who don't have the resources or maybe the training to do it themselves. So one of my favorite stories is not a large building at all. It's actually a preschool, one of our clients that serves homeless kids and families in downtown DC. And one of our optimization engineers identified around 20% in energy savings just by making minor adjustments to their existing building automation system. It was some scheduling issues, fixing their economizer mode, limiting some set points, but all of that was free to the preschool because it was just adjustments. But it's a small preschool, so 20% savings was around $9,000, but that kind of money really can go a long way in a preschool.
So we talked about greenhouse gases a little bit already, carbon emissions, and how these are generally bad and something that we want to reduce, right? That's essentially what the concept of decarbonization is, the idea of reducing your carbon emissions. And to break that down more, there's direct emissions and there's indirect emissions. So that's scope 1 emissions and then those scope 2 emissions. And really what Julie was just talking about was those indirect emissions, those scope 2, right? The idea of using controls or using monitoring and analysis to optimize your energy use and to optimize the way your equipment is operating. But now we're going to move into those scope 1 emissions, those direct emissions, and talk a little bit about the two key factors here that go into how the HVAC industry and sustainability relate. And those two factors are electrification and refrigerant management. So we're going to start with electrification. And really what this is it's using electricity for heating in place of burning fossil fuels in your building. So an example of that would be using an electric heat pump instead of a gas-fired burner in your basement. But really, an important part of understanding this is that electrification alone will not reduce your emissions. Essentially, what you're doing with electrification is you're shifting those scope 1 emissions, the burner in your basement that's burning fossil fuels, and you're taking those and shifting them to scope 2 emissions, right? So now you're using electricity instead of natural gas. So you're probably wondering, why is this good for sustainability? If you're just pushing the emissions from your building onto a power plant, how is that actually solving anything or reducing emissions? Well, the answer here is renewable energy. The hope is that our scope 2 emissions will be reduced because power plants are shifting towards renewable energy. And luckily for us in DC, this is a reality because of the Clean Energy DC Act, where we have the goal of achieving 100% renewable energy sources by 2032. And to kind of put this into perspective with how shifting scope 1 to scope 2 emissions can be effective, here's a little example, right? And that bottom highlighted line is what I really want to focus on. So this first column, this is gas electric today. This is a scenario with a building using a combination of, electric heaters and, like we said, that natural gas boiler in your basement. So that's what this first column is, a combination of the two. And with that, we see, of course, these are arbitrary numbers. They're not perfect, but the purpose is to give you some perspective on how renewable energy is going to make electrification very sustainable. So this first column, we've got 1,097 tons of CO2 emissions coming from, like we said, that combination of gas and electric heat. So if we're staying today and we shift that gas burner into an electric heater, then we see that we haven't really reduced our CO2 emissions, right? We reduced them by 3 tons. And that's because, let's say today, power plants use 5% renewable energy. You're not going to see a significant decrease in total emissions today just because power plants don't use renewable energy as they hopefully will going forward. So now let's move forward into 2030, where we can assume that these power plants are now using closer to 67% of their energy from renewable sources. And here we see, with that combination of gas and electric heat, we're at about 544 tons of total emissions. But if we switch, again, that gas-fired burner into something like a water source heat pump or electric heaters, we're reducing our total CO2 emissions by about 82 tons. And then let's take it even a step further and say that our power plants are now using 85% renewable energy. And we see that number reduced even further, all the way to 213 tons. So this is the general idea of electrification, right? The concept of getting rid of your scope 1 emissions, turning them into scope 2 emissions, and then having the power plants that are slowly shifting more towards renewable energy use take on those emissions and thus have them reduced pretty significantly. The other factor we talked about is refrigerants, right? And the first thing we have to understand about refrigerants is what's known as GWP, which stands for global warming potential. And the idea here that we need to understand is that if a refrigerant has a lower GWP, that means they're going to have lower CO2 emissions. And that's what you're seeing here in this chart. We've got our different pressure equipments, and then we see the more common refrigerants in R410A, R134A, and R123. And then we see those what's called next gen refrigerants in R466A and R1234ZE, and how much of a lower GWP they have. And to put this into perspective, the idea of GWP, methane has a GWP of 74, while R134A, a fairly common refrigerant, has a GWP of 1,300. So, this again goes to show how the HVAC industry does have a very significant impact with sustainability. And the general idea here with refrigerants is that as time goes on, whether it's from legislation or something like that, we are generally shifting away from these higher GWP refrigerants to these lower GWP refrigerants. In fact, Maryland has a target date of 2024 to phase out all HFC refrigerants, which includes R22, R410A, and R134A, which you can see on this graph. And what does this mean for you? Well, new equipment will have to incorporate newer refrigerants, right? So down the road, when you're looking at a chiller replacement, the reality is that we're going to be implementing these chillers with these next-gen refrigerants that have lower CO2 emission potential. And if you want to learn more about refrigerants, there is a talk with Trane coming up on November 16th, and I do recommend you go check that out. And now we're going to shift once again into how businesses are impacted from, a legislation perspective and a corporate perspective.
All right, so legislation. So what is the government's response to climate change? In our local area, much is being done in the form of laws, mandates, codes, incentives, and grants. So local governments are coming out with pretty aggressive net zero goals, renewable energy goals, and the good news is that they're working to develop resources and have developed a lot of great resources to help building owners meet those goals. So Ken mentioned earlier in DC, all large private buildings over 50,000 square feet must benchmark their energy usage. This has been in effect for a while, and report the results to DOEE for public disclosure. So starting next year, that's going to go down to 25,000 square feet will be required to benchmark. And as part of the Clean Energy Act of 2018, a Building Energy Performance Standard, or BEPS, has also been established. So this standard establishes a minimum Energy Star score that DC buildings must meet, and if they they must comply within a certain amount of time. So the first compliance cycle started January 1 of this year and ends in 2027. So if a building doesn't meet that threshold, then they have until 2027 to remedy that. So we're working with a lot of our DC clients to help them get onto that path. Montgomery County, where we are, requires building owners as well to benchmark their energy use, and is also working to approve a BEPS law, much like DC. So Arlington County and Fairfax County both have net zero goals. So Arlington County has a goal of becoming carbon neutral by 2050 and Fairfax by 2040. So a lot going on in our local area.
And so Julie just really tackled the some of the changes that are being made from the government. But the reality is that corporations are doing something similar on their own. In fact, corporations are taking action by setting sustainability goals. And we talked about Trane's sustainability goals earlier with, the Gigaton Challenge and leading by example. But we can see that many companies are doing something similar. And Apple, one of the bigger tech companies out there, and Berkshire Hathaway, one of the bigger investment companies out there, are also doing something like this, establishing their own sustainability goals just to get them out there. And many of these corporations are formalizing these goals by developing what's known as an ESG plan. And an ESG plan is essentially a snapshot of a business's impact as it relates environment, society, and governance. And that's what you're seeing here down at the bottom of the screen, is essentially these companies create these formalized sustainability plans, and then these plans do get evaluated by other groups out there. And this in turn does have some pretty serious business impacts. In fact, BlackRock, a different large investment company, came out and said that they admit that they're going to be using ESG ratings to evaluate businesses, right? So this is kind of putting it into perspective that, sustainability, we think about it as strictly an environmental thing, but the reality is that it does affect, a business's bottom line with things like ESG ratings. There's also other things that impact businesses that are related to sustainability. Marketing and public perception are big. People generally tend to want to consume goods from more sustainable companies. The same goes for employee attraction and retention. Same thing there. Employees generally prefer businesses that have these lofty sustainability goals. And in fact, we're even seeing that businesses with high sustainability goals have generally higher operating margins and lower volatility. In fact, Accenture came out with a study that said between 2013 and 2019, companies with consistently high environmental, social, and governance performance enjoyed 4.7 times higher operating margins and lower volatility than low ESG performers over the same period. And really, the point of this is just to emphasize that third pillar. Sustainability, it's not necessarily just the right thing to do. It does have direct impacts on your business. Julie, did you want to chime in here?
Yeah, I was just going to say, we see this with our clients all the time. They come to us with a particular issue. We were have been working with a medical office building in Chevy Chase, for example. So just to tell a little story. So this client came to us with really operational issues, old equipment, unhappy, uncomfortable tenants, an old building automation system that, they were not able to, as they had new tenants coming in, they couldn't connect, the new equipment to the old, things like that. So we were able to work with this client and to upgrade their systems, upgrade their lighting. We were able to, it was I believe it was around a 10-month payback for the project, which was great. But, we were able to get them over $100,000 in incentive money, which really kind of made that payback nicer for them. But again, in terms of business impact, that's money they're going to save every year. Their energy consumption went down by 36%. So that's money. They've improved their operating expenses, moving forward, and really it became a financial win for them for that project. So speaking of financial incentives, so I alluded to this earlier, the government wants buildings to be more energy efficient. So what that means for us in the local area is that there's many resources to help building owners pay for energy efficiency upgrades. In the example that I used a few minutes ago, the customer didn't necessarily go into didn't come to us and say, hey, we want to save energy. But because the upgrades that they made saved energy, we were able to get them free money to help them upgrade their building. So all levels of government want to help. There's federal, state, and local programs and incentives to help you do this. So they do this in the form of tax incentives, utility incentives, rebates, grants, and loan programs. So I love this quote from the Maryland Energy Association that's kind of in the middle of this slide here next to Empower Maryland. You can see, because people say, well, why does the power company and the government, why do they want to give you more money to be energy efficient? Well, energy efficiency is among the least expensive ways to meet the growing electricity demands for the state. PEPCO and our area, governments, they don't want to build a bunch of new power plants. They would rather meet that demand by lowering usage in existing buildings, on top of the fact of the environmental impact. So, the good news is that energy upgrades generally means you get to replace your old stuff that's not working with new stuff, right? So if you have an old chiller building automation system that's not meeting your needs, it's likely very inefficient compared to newer equipment. So you can use those utility incentives to help you pay for it and get money back on your taxes for it. So we actually just last month helped one of our it was a private school client that had an old building automation system. Again, didn't come to us and say, hey, we want to save energy, but they couldn't afford to fully upgrade their system. And we said, okay, well, let's see if we can, upgrade your building automation system and implement optimization strategies and things like that. And we were able to help them get half the project paid for through utility incentives. So, and if you don't even have a penny to spend on upgrades, that's okay too. There's financing programs of Montgomery County Green Bank and PACE and other private financing for energy efficiency financing, where you don't even have to put any money down if you don't want to. So there's things like I mentioned tax incentives, the federal tax incentive 179D. There's state tax incentives for some states. Maryland has a lot of great incentives. They really want to incentivize people to have energy efficient buildings and do renewable energy projects. One tax incentive is actually for installing energy storage systems, such as thermal storage. And then grants. Grants vary very much by your geography. So there's federal grants for energy efficiency, state grants depending on where you are, and then your local city may even have grants. So, these entities are giving away millions and millions of dollars for energy efficiency projects. So, always something great to look into. And if you struggle with how to do that, we, can definitely help you out with that. So. Okay, so recognition. So I mentioned a couple of these measuring sticks. So a lot of entities, many businesses have sustainability goals for a lot of different reasons, like Ken said. And most of them are not just trying to do the right thing. They're trying to, increase the valuation of their business and use that for marketing efforts and things like that. So this is using those measuring sticks like LEED and Energy Star and applying for, building competitions for the most efficient building. A lot of different competitions like that is really a great way to market your building and your business. So Energy Star, as I mentioned, I'm sure most of you have heard of Energy Star at this point, but it's a program from the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency and DOE that really provides a measuring stick for energy usage. So it is strictly limited to that. It's a 0 to 100 scale. But Energy Star certified buildings use on average 35% less energy. So translate that in savings to your electric bill. And generate, therefore generate 35% fewer greenhouse gas emissions than their peers. The USGBC's LEED certification program, it most widely used sustainable building rating system around the world. And it does follow more than just energy. So it does follow the 3 pillars of sustainability. These buildings create, on average, 34% less emissions and consume 25% less energy. WELL is a relatively newer rating system that focuses on employee health through the quality of air, water, and light. So it's a program that is growing. Obviously, the pandemic has definitely shined a light a little bit more on this rating system, and more projects are going after this WELL certification. There's another healthy building rating system, Fitwell. There's a smart building rating system called Spire. So a lot of different measuring sticks, and again, a great way to not only market your building, but really use it to help make sure, define what is sustainable, what is energy efficient, and what is healthy to meet those standards. So that's all we have for you today. We are wrapping up a little bit early, which is great because we have some time for questions. So we'll wait just a few minutes, see if anybody has any questions for us.
It looks like there's one question in the chat. I'll give this one to you, Julie. Are energy grids local to neighborhoods?
Well, no. Yes and no. How's that for an answer? So the United States energy grid is ubiquitous. However, there are different entities that I'll say run different geographies. So in our particular area, our operator is called PJM, and PJM extends through, I should know this off the top of my head, but several states, so a pretty large geographic area. As far as the local operators, we have, PEPCO in our area, and they're different entities that serve different neighborhoods, I'll say. So, but it's more than generally a neighborhood. So those electricity distributors, they generally serve a smaller geographic area. So that's why your bill won't ever say PJM, the regional transmission operator. It'll come from your local provider, PEPCO, or if you're deregulated like we are in Maryland, you can choose who your provider is. That is not the case in Virginia. That's a regulated state. So I believe definitely in our Northern Virginia, it's Dominion, so there's not a choice there. DC is also deregulated, so they can choose their who they buy their electricity from as well. Hopefully I answered that.
It looks like she has a follow-up to that.
Okay.
And reducing the demand on these grids is the driver for grant money rights.
Sorry, can you say it again?
Second. And reducing the demand on these grids is the driver for grant money, right? That's the question.
Yes. Yeah, the federal, it can be different ones. So it depends on what the grants are for. There's so many grants out there. It's an area that Boland has gotten into relatively recently. There are grants for making your building more energy efficient. There are grants for encouraging electrification, like you mentioned, Ken. There are grants for reducing demand, just specifically demand. So like I mentioned, the one for thermal storage, or that's a tax credit. But so a lot of these grants can be very specific to, a lot of them are for renewable energy. So, depending on what a building owner wants to do and is trying to do, that's kind of how we shop for grants, I'll say. And also, again, in their specific geography. So, and that's how we also decide, is something going to be like a city or a state or a federal grant? But many of them are to reduce consumption and demand and really lighten the load on the grid and incorporate renewable energy into the grid as well. Great questions. Keeping me on my toes. What I'll say is that, first of all, thanks everybody for your time. And we hope that you'll all join us as we do dig into energy a little bit deeper next week. Again, same time, same place. So our Energy 101 class is really focusing on, well, energy, but kind of diving into the basics. We hear from a lot of our customers who are facilities professionals who have now been tasked with energy and sustainability goals, and they're telling us, I'm not really sure what is the difference between KW and KWH. So understanding those basic concepts not only empowers you to, speak the language and understand, but really to start learning how to make your building more energy efficient yourself. And some of the, understanding concepts that can help you save a bunch of money. So we'll be diving into that next week. So please join us for that. And if you have any questions, please feel free to contact Kanan or I. And we want to thank everybody for your time today. Hope it was helpful.